Welcome back to Chime In. I'm Celeste Day. Thank you for joining us for Voting Part 3. We have an exciting show for you tonight. We have two guests with us, including our Chime In hosts. We have our Georgia House of Representatives, Billy Mitchell, who has been a member of the Georgia House and has joined us in the past. He was here with us when we did voting the first time with Donna McLeod. We are super excited to have him. Unfortunately, you guys won't see him, but you'll hear him. He will be available to answer your questions. So I want you guys to make sure, while the hosts are introducing themselves, that you're sharing our live Facebook feed.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Andrea. Welcome to Chime In.
Hi, I'm Julius Caesar. Welcome back to Chime In.
Again, I said I was Celeste Day. I want to ask our additional guest. He is a New York City resident. He also is an avid follower of Chime In, and we're excited to have him participate with us today. His name is Cosby Smiley. Cosby, can you say a few words?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Cosby Smiley. I am representing the New York City voting block, and also When We All Vote. That's where I'm the team captain here in New York State.
That's
Welcome
awesome.
to Chime In.
Thank you. And Billy, do you want to say a few words?
Well, it's certainly great to be with you all again. Technology being what it is, I'd love to be seen. Hopefully that we can get great information. But I consider it an honor to be on your show. The first time is always a pleasure, but when you're invited back again, that means you didn't do terribly the first time. So good to be with you. It's been an exciting day in Georgia for voters, and glad to be able to share some information with you.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you again for joining us. So before we start just really jumping into the voting, there's so much that's been going on. So I wanted to try to share some of the things that you all know, that you've been hearing about, but let's make sure it's in the forefront of this voting conversation. So yesterday, the Senate confirmed that Judge Amy Barrett would fill the seat of the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The final 52-48 vote tally is the first time in modern history that a nominee received 0 votes from the minority party. Her confirmation is seen as a huge win for the Republican Party, and especially Donald Trump, who has now appointed 3 Supreme Court justices in his term. It also means that President Trump, even if he doesn't win the next term, he will have cemented his legacy through these appointments. So why is some of this important? We're going to talk about this when we go through our conversation with Cosby and with Representative Mitchell, but also just to kind of keep us informed and knowing what's going on yesterday, today, tomorrow. So we all know that Joe Biden has 87% chance of victory according to Optimist prediction model. President Trump is keeping multiple daily rallies. He is traveling often, as well as Biden is traveling to those states that have been known to be solidly red states. So he'll be in Iowa on Friday, and Kamala will be in Texas. On Monday, the court ruled that Wisconsin cannot accept mail-in ballots arriving after the election day. And now, tomorrow, the justices are expected to weigh in on an emergency request involving North Carolina and Pennsylvania, those swing states, that would be deciding on whether those states could extend their deadlines for accepting absentee ballots, a move that could affect our presidential election. Okay, so with all of that said, I'm gonna ask Andrea to kick us off.
I think everyone has the right to vote, and our ancestors worked very, very hard to get us to this point. I think we should take it as a personal obligation to get out there and vote. It doesn't really matter who you're voting for, but I think just take it upon yourself that you need to go out and vote. And our ancestors did enough for us where it's left to us right now where we need to go and make our vote count. Saying that with everything that's going on with the 2020 election, do you trust the mail-in, aka absentee ballot process as much as you would have trusted the election in the past? Julius, do you have any information on that?
Well, I trust the absentee ballot system so well that I voted absentee ballot this year because I did not want to take a chance and go out to the polls. The thing what I did though, I requested the absentee ballot early and returned it early and then went online to check to see if it was received, and it was. So the system works, it's just that you have to be very deliberate on what you want to do and get it in on time. If you're trying to mail your absentee ballot off the day of, for some states that might work for you because some states may give you 3 days or up to 7 days after the election day to get your ballot, as long as it was postmarked on the 3rd. Other states, if the ballot is not received on the 3rd, it doesn't count. So anything coming in after the 3rd is going to go in the trash. And if that's what the state law is, that's what the state law is, and rightfully so. They're obligated to follow the law, and if it came in after the 3rd, yeah, it's going in the trash, but whose fault is it? It's the persons who did not send in that absentee ballot 7 to 14 days before, so it'll be there on time.
Billy, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think Julius is very wise in that I would not at this point trust the mail system to mail my ballot back at this point. If you were going to mail it at all, what I would suggest to you is there are what we call mail drop boxes all around the counties that you live in Georgia, where you can take your absentee ballot, literally place it in a secure ballot receptacle, which they do and empty every day at 7 p.m. If you can't do that, I would take it to the voter registration and elections poll and hand it in. If you can't do that, you have until October 30th to go vote early. And of course, the last alternative would be to vote on election day, which I'm not recommending to anyone. I suggest you use one of the other methods because I suspect there will be very long lines on election day.
Cosby, do you have anything to say about that and the election?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad that you brought up the absentee voting responsibility because it does depend on what state you're a resident of. And here in New York City, I voted early, as this is our first year actually having early voting for our presidential election. So we're very excited about that. I got my sticker, my wristband. The good news about that is that I got to see firsthand what is going on with the actual voting process. And what I'm recommending to everybody in my cohort is that you do request the absentee ballot. Today was the last day to request an absentee ballot in New York State via phone or online, but you can still get one in person from the election board. If you have the absentee ballot, number one, you get to see everything that's on the ballot, all the candidates, all the questions, and have an opportunity to research your vote. But secondly, during early voting, all the way up to the 8 p.m. on election day, you don't have to wait in the line. You can just walk to the front and turn in your absentee ballot. They'll check your name off and you're done. So that kind of accomplishes a number of our check boxes about being safe, secure, you know it got there, and you don't put yourself at any heightened risk for COVID at the very latest, at the extreme. So mail it if you can. You can track it. There's one other thing that I did hear Julia say about tracking your ballot. You get the recognition that it was accepted is different from received. So that's one of the things that we've been advocating in many states. Make sure that you check the status of your ballot all the way through to accept it, because many of them were received, but due to clerical errors or written items, they didn't get accepted, and those votes did not count.
This election has been full of issues. And Billy, could you tell us some of the biggest issues for this 2020 election, and tell us some of the issues that did not exist before this year, 2020?
Mm. Well, of course, we have the presidential election, and we also were the only state in the nation. Georgia's the only state in the nation, I should say, that has two U.S. Senate seats that are open for election, which is very, very unusual. Georgia could decide the fate of the U.S. Senate, whether it will be run by Democrats or whether it will be run by Republicans. It could come down to those two seats if you only need three seats to change the leadership of the U.S. Senate. So that's very important. But we have a sheriff's race that's on the ballot this year in DeKalb County. We also have some resolutions that we're going to have to vote on that will change some of the constitutions. Number one will be whether there should be an ethics panel uh, formed in DeKalb County that will deliberate upon issues of violating ethics of elected officials and public employees of DeKalb County. One other very important legislation that will be voted on in the resolution, you'll have to vote yes or no. Do you want the Constitution to change to have what we call the right to sue government? Right now, government in just in most cases are immune from being sued. So we call that sovereign immunity. There has to be a very, very slim area where you would be allowed to sue government. There are those who wish to change that in certain cases where government has violated your rights. Where government has violated your rights, if the people say yes to this, you will be able to sue government to recover any damages or to make yourself whole in that case. Now, interestingly enough, the more conservative legislators, they wanted that done because some governments were outlawing guns and say you couldn't bring guns in our business, in our schools and the like. So they didn't like that. So they said we should be able to sue government because it's an infringement on our rights. And you had Democrats who liked that because, quite frankly, government is more likely to abuse those who don't have much power, and they become immune to penalties in most cases. If we look at the Breonna Taylor case in Kentucky, much of those police will not be prosecuted at all because of how difficult it is to sue government.
Yeah. You wanted to say something, Cosby?
No, I was
Say
just
that again.
agreeing with that. This is just Cosby chiming in, Billy. I just think that's very important because that was one of our rights to address grievances was being able to hold the government accountable, and that's what we definitely have to vote to maintain the right to vote, basically.
Right. So, Cosby, I want to ask you this question. So we have been, I think, bombarded with information over the last, 3 months more than ever. But I was sent a clip that talked about how the Republican Party was largely African Americans, and the concept for me of watching this clip and hearing about the just kind of the thoughts and ideals that existed and how the party shifted from Republican to Democrat really occurred. I was hoping that you could shed some light on that information, and I know that you had an opportunity to see that clip as well. Can you share some information about that and your thoughts?
I hope so. So when you first asked this question, I was wondering how far back we really wanted to go because there's a common thought and theory about modern history with regard to the African American community became entrenched in the Democratic Party right along the time of the last civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and Lyndon B. Johnson and the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. But the reality is that the shift happened a little bit before that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt really reached out to all American citizens with his New Deal and came forward with all of the alphabets, the Social Security and retirement funds and stuff like that, that appealed to African Americans who just wanted to work and wanted to earn their way. The Roosevelt administration opened that up as a function of, um, rebuilding the country after World War II, as well as rewarding those individuals from the entire country. And that's why we always say American history is really Black American history or African American history. But one of the clips that I saw really goes further back than that. And it's really important. I'll be brief. It's the election of 1876.
Okay.
And the majority of the African Americans in the country were ex slaves who were part of the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party, they had an election that was so contentious that there wasn't a clear winner up until hours before the inauguration. And at the end of that battle, for lack of a better word, they went to court. They were rioting in the streets, etc. It came down to what we call a great compromise. And because of that election and because of the Democrats at the time, who were mostly the whites, slave owners and landowners, gave up the presidency to the Republicans at the time, who were the black members of the country, with the stipulation that the federal government would withdraw its support of Reconstruction. And so, if you let that sink in for a minute, all of the gains that we made after slavery ended, and all of the senators and congressmen and the majority rule of those southern states that was allowed to happen because these newly freed slaves were able to elect their own politicians, was taken away because of one election.
Wow. That is something to really think about. I mean, the conversation also, and I really want to also ask Billy his thoughts about, his thoughts about this, because we talk about, are you following the party? So this really, for me, begs the question around, are you following the party? Are you entrenched into the policies? How do people really decide, right? That's really what's difficult. So Billy, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, let me just say I can't hear the other guest, and I hope I'm not being repetitive on what he's saying. But
Oh,
I will tell, but I will tell you this: black people are very pragmatic folks. In fact, up until about the early '60s, most black folks were Republicans. In fact, that came out as a result of Abraham Lincoln because of his Emancipation Proclamation. The black folk in this country were supportive of Republicans. But interestingly enough, as soon as black folks started to support Republicans, primarily through efforts of Abraham Lincoln, free slaves, and others, many of the then Republicans and many of the Democrats were the could be racist and the like. Now that maintained all the way up until Martin Luther King's father started a movement to gain civil rights, and when LBJ, President Johnson, signed the civil rights legislation, most black folks in this country started to become Democrats. And interestingly enough, the white conservatives left the Democratic Party and became Republicans. So I would suggest to you that black folks in particular are pretty much policy driven in that they look to see which party is going to support policies and issues that best suits their needs.
Absolutely.
And I would suspect that if the Democrats were to embrace racist policies and the Republican Party were to embrace policies that would enhance their living and their pursuit of happiness, they would change today as well.
Most definitely.
Thank you. I love the fact that, so Billy, you couldn't hear Cosby, but he did share the same information in his own way. I love the fact that I have the two of you on here, informed, intelligent, sharing what we need to hear. So it is absolutely fine because you presented that information, and it was great. So, Julius?
Hey, Billy, there are some conspiracy theories out there that not only did the Russians influence the 2016 election by putting a lot of stuff out there on social media and doing all kind of other stuff, but there's some conspiracy theories that the Russians literally got into some of these voting systems and changed votes for Donald Trump. Remember that I say that to say this. When you go to vote in America, you do not vote from a general federal voting system. Everybody votes locally. Some local systems are very good, and they have firewalls, and they're protected from hackers. Others are not the same. Whereas in other countries, the federal government does one vote. It's not a local thing. It's federally operated. Everybody goes to vote on the same day. So I say this, that to say this. Do you think the system in Georgia is safe, or is it vulnerable to hackers?
I am convinced that our voting process is a safe process in that no voting machine is connected to the internet. It's much like an individual computer, and the only time that they're connected would be when they are actually transferring the votes to the main central headquarters to calculate them all. And then even after that, they take the machines that are locally, they count them, and they have to be consistent with what has been transmitted. So I'm convinced that we've also added what we call a paper trail, whereas what you voted on now gets collected, and there's some safeguards that they have to be audited and they can be counted and the like. I will say to you that there was no question that there was some Russian and other interference in our last election. But what was discovered was where the interference came from was just this misinformation campaign. Let's just take a state like Georgia, for instance. Trump won about 100,000 votes, but we had just in DeKalb County alone, we had about 200,000 black folks who were eligible, registered to vote, who did not vote. And when they surveyed them, they came up with reasons like, well, I heard all this negative information about his opponent, Hillary Clinton. I didn't like that. I didn't like Trump, so I didn't vote at all. And once they found out that much of the information that they heard was misinformation, in fact, just fake and created, they felt a little differently about that. Same way with Michigan. Trump won Michigan by just, about 11,000 votes it was. But the amount of black men who did not vote in the state of Michigan is just incredible. And once again, their main number one reason for not voting was this misinformation. To actually literally manipulate the vote, I don't think that is as much of a concern as it is the misinformation, which there's been things done to make sure that doesn't happen. I would tell you, a decade ago, we used to vote we literally darkened in a little bubble, and then we submitted that, and they had to be hand counted. And there was always stories, particularly in rural counties and rural cities, where the vote would always come out by the way the people who were doing the counting. Whatever the people in the counting did, and there was no way to verify or see if that was legitimate. So I think it's much, much safer than it is now. I do agree, though, that we're getting to a point now, particularly with technology being what it is, that we may need to have a federal system, federal oversight of elections as opposed to 50 different ways to carry out an election.
It's more like 3,000 different ways right now.
You're absolutely right. When you talk about all the counties, and no question about it.
I think overall the voting system is very safe, but I think the Republican tried to embed it that believe in our black community that the vote is not very safe, so a lot of people don't want to vote already. So with them saying the vote is already it's not safe, they're saying why do I go? Why should I go vote if it's not safe? Why should I waste my time to go out and vote? And if I vote, it does not count, and if I don't vote, it does not count. So I think it's just for our community, it was put out there to put fear in us not to go and vote because most of us is going to go vote for the Republican. And Trump knows that, so he's trying to
for the Republican.
Democrats.
Okay, I can't let that one go.
For the Democrats, and I think he put that out there, so a lot of us will stay home and not vote and don't let our vote count. And this brought us to the question why there is such a long line and the wait time to vote in our black community much more than in our the other communities.
Well, it's no question. Yeah, it's no question about it that those who have the power want to put in place obstacles that would prevent us or suppress our vote. Simply being, the more we vote, the more power our community gains, and the ability that we have to stop those kinds of things from occurring. So no question about it, they wish to stop us from doing that. I will tell you, in the last primary election we had people standing in line for 8 hours in the rain. And as you mentioned, Andrea, there were precincts in the urban community where they did not have enough voting machines. People were waiting in line for 8 hours past midnight. And then if you went to the suburban communities, they had more voting machines than they needed, and they had folks, in and out in 10, 15 minutes. So I think those kinds of issues were intentionally designed. But I will tell you, since the primary election, they've increased the number of voting precincts. They increased the number of voting machines that will be at each precinct. There's going to be a technology expert at every precinct in Georgia in case there's some issues. And there's going to be a battery of lawyers just hanging around everywhere to make sure the process is smooth. Even with all that said, I'm going to tell you that there's still going to be some lines because I believe people are so enthusiastic and will vote. But, what we're telling folks is that we need to vote in numbers too large to suppress. And if we do that, no matter what tactics they try, we'll be okay. As I mentioned earlier, let's give you this as an example. And Andrea, you cut me off if I go too long. So let me give you this as an example. Stacey Abrams ran for governor 2 years ago, and she lost by 1.4%. Actually, it was 1.37%, which equates to 53,000 votes over this entire state. Incredibly close when you figure that, the amount of millions of people who voted. But even with that voter suppression, even with the fact that the Secretary of State cheated, even with all the tactics they used, we had over 100,000 black men in DeKalb County that did not vote. We had over 200,000 black men, not counting others, 200,000 black men all over the state who were registered and did not vote. He only lost by 53,000. If we had voted in the numbers that we were capable of, she still would have been governor. We still then could have put people in place to make sure those kinds of things not happen. So our rallying cry now is let's vote in numbers too large to suppress.
Yeah, Billy, so I remember you sharing that statistic when you and Donna McLeod was on, and I remember being shocked by that. And I will tell you that I completely agree with how Georgia has been able to change the early voting process. So this was my first time voting early, and I had every plan to fly home to Massachusetts to vote because I had such anxiety over voting in the state of Georgia. And I voted on Friday, and it was 15, 20 minutes tops. It was just an unbelievable process. They were very organized. They had more people. They had more people than they had voters, in the facility that I voted in. So I absolutely agree with you. People shouldn't hesitate to get out there. But I had heard so many things about waiting for 5 and 6 hours and 8 hours to vote. In my experience, has never been more than 40 minutes at tops to vote, and that's always on election day. And so I agree with you, and just trying to plug that don't be afraid to get out there and do the early voting. Like Cosby and Billy just mentioned, it is, people have made some tremendous strides to make sure that this is a safe process for people and a respectful one in terms of their time.
Well, with that being said, Billy, I'm going to ask Billy a question, and then Cosby, feel free to join in or chime in after Billy, because I think you can hear Billy Cosby. But Billy, if you were in control of the Georgia voting system, what are some of the things that you would put in place to improve the system and the turnout and the way people vote?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the first things that I would do is, and Julius and Cosby as black men on this call, let me just tell you, if we could find a solution for this, we could be very wealthy men. We could take this national, if not internationally, and really do something with it. But for some reason, black men do not participate in the election process as well as black women. The number one voting demographic, and get this, the number one voting demographic, not only in Georgia, but in this nation, are black women. Black women vote at a higher percentage than any other demographic in this country. It's just truly amazing. Black women are getting it done. When Stacey Abrams won, for an example, black women voted like 74, 73%, whereas black men were under 50%. If we could find a way to motivate black men to go to the polls, even over 50%, maybe we'll never catch up with black women, but even at just 50%, we would see change in this country like you would not believe. That'd be number one. Number two, what I would do is get a true receipt format for voting. When I go to my ATM machine, I can vote. I can take out money. It tells me how much I have left. It tells me exactly what I have in there. For some reason, we fear doing that with our voting process. I think once we get people who have the full confidence that when they vote, their vote will be counted, and it will be counted just as they cast it, I think that we'd have much better participation as well.
I'm gonna piggyback on what Billy says. I'm gonna challenge every black woman, wives, husband, please take your spouse, your boyfriend, whoever it is, with you when you're going to vote. There's 70% of black male that does not vote, and I want you to know that your vote does count. So I'm gonna challenge a woman to take it upon yourself as your responsibility to take your husband and whoever it is you're going out with, grab them with you and take them to the voting poll, and your vote will count. A lot of people, and I think a lot of people, the reason why a lot of people don't vote, they have this misconception that if I don't vote, my vote won't count. Like, where does my vote go when it counts? And if I vote, it don't count, and if I don't vote, so what? So it's like, you need to know that your vote, one vote, will make a difference.
Well, before you respond, Cosby, I have a solution for that right now.
Oh, let's write it
Tax
down.
time is tax time is coming up for 2020 and 2021. So we need to just pass a law for all males who did not vote. You don't get your tax refund. You'll be surprised how we'll be out there voting.
Oh, no question about that.
Wow, wow.
You know,
That was a
there's some
left turn,
countries,
George.
Julius, to your point, there are some countries that if you do not vote, you get a fine. And these are countries that vote like 80%. This country, for some reason, is one of the few countries that tries to suppress the vote. But there are many countries out there where it is almost mandatory that you do have to vote, and you subject yourself to penalties if you don't.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cosby.
Um, the, the good news about this discussion is that Billy really hit the nail on the head. There are some countries where voting is the expected behavior. America as a whole, not just black people, but as a whole, are under 60% voting. So that means that there's 40% of the entire population that's eligible to vote that's not sharing with us what their thoughts are. Um, what I would change in terms of Georgia's situation is the equality. That's my theme whenever I'm on Chime In. I always talk about trust. And the black men, everybody across the board, black men being the ones who fall prey to the misinformation the most. If everybody felt like they could trust the system, they would participate. And the way to make that happen is the disparity between the election machines out in the suburbs or even in the urban areas, but with the higher incomes. There are several more election machines than there are in the lower income population. So I'm happy that my dear heart had a good voting experience in Georgia and that she did not fly home to Massachusetts because that's where we need the votes in those red states. And that was one of my theories from long ago, where there's got to be enough brothers and sisters to move to Kentucky just for a little while, just so they can vote out the oppressive policies, right? And that's because these states that have a majority of black voters, but that are not participating, happen to be a real problem. So in Georgia, in particular, my brother used to work for the election board. He was a supervisor down in Clayton County, and one of the things that he complained about was the communication between the supervisors and the districts in being dynamic on election day to move machines from one location to another. So if you have a line out the door and you only have 5 machines, and you know that over in Henry County they have 5-minute waiting times, you can reallocate those voting machines to a different location, especially during early voting. So election day it might be a little difficult, but that's the reality. And that's also where the technology comes in. What Billy was talking about, the computers not being connected to the network. We've had this discussion on my company web conversations that everything is connected to the network. And so every conversation you have is broadcast out. So the difficulty with having a receipt for your vote means that your secrecy is now compromised by that piece of paper. And so it's a balance between, who did you vote for? I can tell you who I voted for, but you never know unless I tell you, and you can't prove it once we have that piece of paper that opens the door for other things.
Yeah, and Cosby, you made a very good point, probably the most important point, and I should give Donna McLeod, if she's watching out there, it is 100% because of her, and her exact words to me were, Celeste, Massachusetts doesn't need your vote. It's always going to be a blue state. That's what she said to me, and I thought, I'm worried about how long the line is, and I did not even consider that, unfortunately. That was my reality. I'm kind of embarrassed to say that. But you're absolutely right. That is the reason that I voted here.
Yay. Good
Yay.
job.
So I want to ask both you, Cosby and Billy, this question because I've had this conversation with friends over the last several months, but I had a similar conversation at the last election, and that was this concept of who do you vote for when you are not necessarily in support of either candidate. So I've had conversations about, in the last election, we've heard people talk about, I wasn't a supporter of Trump, but there's no way I was going to vote for Hillary, right? And so I've heard people say that, and I've heard people say, so I didn't vote for Hillary, I voted against Hillary by voting for Trump. And we've heard people talk about the fact that that is largely, potentially, how Trump got in office. So what I've been thinking about, my question is to you guys is it better to vote for your least favorite candidate, if you will, or not vote at all? So Billy, you want to start?
I'd be glad to. This is probably a perfect time to give some advice that I got a long time ago. Voting is not like marriage where you're trying to wait for that perfect one to come along and death do you part and love forever, ever. Voting is like public transportation in that you're waiting for the bus. And if there's not a bus that is going to go exactly where you want to go, you don't go home and say, oh, the bus isn't going exactly where I wanted to, so I'm going to stay home, do nothing, don't work on my job or whatever. What you do is you take the bus that is going closest to where you want to go. And it's only through doing that repeatedly where you'll see progress in your community, progress within yourself, is that we want to take the bus that goes as closest to where we want to go. I would venture to say that in every election, folks aren't going to be identical. There is one that will get you closer to where you want your community to be. Now, there may be some issues about that candidate that you don't like, but one of them will get you closer to where you want to be. And if you repeatedly do that, you'll find the kind of progress in your community that you would like.
I love that analogy. Thank you. Cosby?
Now, I'm going to say the best way to describe it for me is that it's not a zero-sum game. One of the things that we did in New York is we just voted on ranked voting, which gives you an opportunity to select your number one candidate, your number two candidate, and your number three candidate. And what that does is take away your necessity to pick one or the other. So we kind of have a way to get around that. But the problem as it came down is that as we put forward, all politics is local. And so regardless of who's at the top of the ticket for the president, and that's the one office that the entire country votes on. That's the only office that the entire country votes on. But everybody down the ticket, your senators, your state representatives, your state senators, your local ombudsman, your district leaders, your city council people are the people who impact your life more on a day-to-day basis than those guys. So you're already, so my position is you got to go to the polls because you have to vote for the local, right? So you're already there. Pick one or the other at the top.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. So it sounds like there's consensus there that not voting is not an option, right? So we need to get out there and vote. I didn't know if my chime-in host wanted to say anything.
Well, absolutely. I believe that whether you're voting against somebody or you're voting for somebody, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you exercise that civil right to go out and vote either way. But get your vote in, make your vote count. And like Billy was expressing, pick the candidate that's belief and policies and is going to support the things closest to what you support. And if you continue to do that, eventually one will come along where they're supporting everything that you support.
And as we talked about last night, when you're voting, you're not voting for your personal reason. You're voting for your community. You're voting for the elderly. You're voting for the children. You're voting for the criminal justice. you're voting as a community. So you need to take that in consideration that I need to go out there and vote for my community because especially your young black men, the Supreme Court and the judges, they're all not non-black. So if they go in front of one of them, they're the one they need to stand in front of. So if we get out and vote, is a vote for our community, and we need to keep that in consideration. And it's because our ancestors made a way for us to go out and vote, and I think we should not neglect that they fought the fight. They fought the fight for us to get out there. So now the only thing we got to do is just to get out there and mark that X. Decide where you're going to put that X and put that X somewhere.
So I want to remind people, and I didn't mention that we have this computer in front of me tonight because I want to be able to read your questions, read your comments. So I want to thank Anicia Williams for letting us know that her best date ever was the date that when she went out to vote, and she put #vote. And also, she loved your analogy, Billy. She thought that was extremely thoughtful. So remember, you guys, send your questions, your comments, and I will see them. They're right here.
Okay. Let me just add one more thing about what Andrea said about voting your conscience. That, in a nutshell, is the problem with our country right now, is that the president has created a situation where you're not voting your conscience, you're voting for your party affiliation. And the people who stand to lose by the policies that he's putting forward are still voting for him because they feel that affiliation, number one. And number two, black people who are successful and who get tax breaks because they're making over $400,000 would in some way be interested in a Republican position, but make the conscious choice to vote for the community where the rest of the country does not.
That's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that.
You know, there's been a lot of uproar with Amy Barrett being rushed onto the Supreme Court. Billy, could you enlighten us on why is it that the Republicans rushed this nomination in to get her in there? Why did Trump and the Republicans want to get her on there so badly? Especially in light of the fact that they did not let Obama's nominee go through during his last term, the last year of his term in office.
Well, specifically, the more conservative legislators, they like to make sure that they get as many conservative jurists as possible because all of these issues could wind up in front of a judge, a court one day. And so all these kinds of issues, they want to put these in front of conservative judges. They don't like certain laws, whether it be how would they feel about giving women the right to choose their reproductive health care, to outright deciding elections. I don't think I need to remind folks that when Bush the second was first elected, he actually did not win by the vote. He won by the Supreme Court, who stepped in and said, okay, you're going to have to stop counting, and essentially made him the president. Yes. And this is the same kind of reasoning that the present president is hoping for. And he has been so bold enough to make public pronouncements that they're going to sue. And he said it will come before the Supreme Court, and I want a court that will be more sensitive and favorable to my issues. And so that's why they're pushing it. To be quite candid with you, when Obama's choice was not allowed to proceed, I thought it was disgusting. I thought that he should have been allowed because he had much more time. However, their reasoning was something that I said, I disagree with it, but I understand their reasoning. Lo and behold, we come up with the same scenario, even worse, because we have elections within weeks, and they wish to push this narrative that they had to appoint a Supreme Court judge, and I just think it's hypocritical. I think it really jeopardizes our democracy, because now they're talking about if Biden should win and Democrats take over the Senate, that they may expand the court. What the opponents are talking about, pack the court. And I do believe that's dangerous because that means the court size will change to fit an ideology as to whomever is elected, and that gets to be dangerous. So it just puts our whole democracy in jeopardy. I think that this was something that they should have waited because the election was so near.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you, Billy, especially the part where if Biden does win, I don't believe that they should go add heads and stack the court because that's a slippery slope. But I do believe that even if the Supreme Court gives Trump the win, if the Democrats take over the House and the Senate, it will be void because they will impeach him, and this time he wouldn't have his Republican friends to say we're not going to have witnesses and stack the deck so he could stay in office. This time they will get him out of there and somebody else will replace him one way or another.
Yeah, I think it's good thought. Good thought. Absolutely.
What'd you say, Cosby?
I would like to not even entertain that.
Okay. So,
So
Billy, we
what I
had a
said.
question from one of our viewers that I really want to make sure that you have an opportunity to answer. And it's Janice Scott, who says that one reason people do not vote is due to the concept of electoral votes. So can you explain that for us? Can you explain the meaning of the electoral college?
Well, I will tell you that I'm getting closer to the point where I'm thinking that we may need to abolish the electoral college. It was put into place during a time where the majority of the citizens lived in just a few states. So in order so that everyone's voice could be heard, they put in an electoral college system so that people would essentially have to campaign in virtually every area of the country. You know, if you went by strictly a popular vote, they would only have to campaign in states like New York, Texas, California, and Illinois, and maybe a couple others. And when you talk about campaigning, that's when the promises are made. Each candidate makes promises that we will hold them to once they get elected. And if they only had to campaign in 5 or 6 states, that means those 5 or 6 states would get the largest of the promises and the attention. And so they felt that that wasn't good. So the electoral system was put in place to prevent that. We're getting to the point now where the country is so populated that we still have situations where they don't campaign in every state. For instance, Puerto Rico is allowed to vote in U.S. elections as a possession, and no candidate goes to Puerto Rico. Same thing could be said with Alaska and a few other states. So we have to come to grips with that. It is a way to safeguard and make certain that everything is relative. We are getting, one of the reasons why they fight so hard, that if we had strictly a popular vote, there probably wouldn't have been a Republican elected in modern history. I mean, Hillary Clinton received about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did nationwide. So we're going to have that pushback for the conservatives. But I'm getting closer to the point that where we are at least going to have to adjust it, if not end it in its entirety.
Got it. So you guys, I didn't realize that we are running close to time. This is such an important topic and we're having such great conversation. But I do want to give you an opportunity, again, because our topic is voting and we have 7 days until the election. So I'd love to ask each of you, starting with Cosby Smiley, to share with people whatever you'd like that is important from you to them about voting for this year's elections, for 2020 election.
Well, thank you. I think that the most important thing for us to recognize and remember for this particular vote is the ability to ever vote again. What we're talking about is law, order, logic, and rational behavior that will prevent one party from playing chess while the other party is playing checkers. And if we can really understand that the way that this thing went off the rails is because we ignored all the signs from one candidate from his announcement to the current day. Everything that he said is so counter to our American principles. It's not a black and white thing. It's not a Republican Democrat thing. It's a let's just play by the rules. And so the first and most important rule that we have is the opportunity to exercise the franchise. You have to vote. You have to take everybody that you know out to vote. You have to make sure, whether it's a date or not, you ladies, to take all of your boyfriends, not just one. Just go back with each of the other ones, right? And make sure that we get it done. But also call your friends in those battleground states, because you have friends in Milwaukee, you have friends in Miami, you have friends in Miami, you have friends in Miami,
Yes, we have
right?
friends in Miami.
Yes, that's so true.
You have friends in Houston, you have friends in Dallas. So these areas are setting records for participation this year because everybody realizes how important it is. And I love you. You need to love me enough to vote for our common good.
Thank you. Thank you. That's awesome. And Billy?
You know, I'm sure Cosby, what he said was profound. I could tell by the reaction from you. It was all profound. I am going to make sure that I look on the post when you post this on Facebook to look at it. You know, to me, voting is like currency, and I just am so sad when I see folks, particularly in our community, that don't get engaged in the process. When you look at the fact that they literally came to our homeland and stole us, ripped us from the arms of our parents, and put us on ships. We survived. Many of us survived the Middle Passage. They dropped some of us off in the Caribbean and Brazil and certainly in the States and Canada and all. And then our people fought that. They fought the bitter racism. They learned to read and write at their peril. They tried to get away, and they understood the power of voting. So they tried to vote, even if it meant life and death in some cases. And they were beaten, and they had dogs attack them, and water hoses and the like. Just to be able to get the right to vote. And here we are, our ancestors' children, and we don't take the opportunity to fulfill their dreams of being able to freely vote and put in the policymakers that would best serve our communities. And when we finally recognize how much that currency is worth and we go out and vote to what our numbers are, we will see drastic change in our community. And lastly, I'm going to say, invariably we hear people say, how come that community seems to be well served and our community doesn't seem to be as well served? Well, the real answer to that is the people who are well served are engaged and informed and involved, and that manifests itself through voting. In communities that are not well served, those people are people that are not engaged, involved, and don't let it manifests itself by not voting. If we can miraculously pick up all the well-served people and put them in the underserved areas, and put all the people in the underserved areas and put them in the well-served areas, virtually overnight, the services will split, simply because the people who are used to being well served will continue to be involved and engaged and manifest that itself through voting. And I will vote and go vote at every opportunity that I get, so they know that our community is a voting community.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Cosby. Those comments were amazing. Next week, we're going to be here having a watch party for the election. I really appreciate everyone's questions and comments. I'm going to just close with what I just heard Billy say is engagement, involvement creates results. Cosby's always talked about the Republicans are in it for the long game. We need to be involved I think he's also said you need to vote like your life depends on it. So thank you for joining Chime In, and we'll see you next Tuesday night. Thank you. Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.